The story always begins the same way. Love believing it is safe. Adoronke Olamide believed love was something you carried with both hands, carefully, like a bowl filled to the brim. You didn't tilt it, you didn't rush it, you didn't give half. You carried it steadily, even when your arms ached. That was how she loved. Fully, softly, without calculations. People used to tell her, "Ronke, you love too deeply. You'll drown one day." She would smile and reply, "If love doesn't drown you, then what is it for?" For 7 years, she had carried her marriage that way. 7 years of waking before dawn to pray for another human being. 7 years of cooking meals she sometimes didn't feel like cooking just because she knew how he liked them. 7 years of listening, supporting, sacrificing, bending. 7 years of believing marriage was teamwork, even when she felt like she was running the race alone. That morning, she stood barefoot in her kitchen in Ibadan, the sun just beginning to stretch its fingers across the tiled floor. A simple Ankara house dress clung to her frame as she stirred a pot of smoky party jollof rice. The scent filled the air, pepper, thyme, bay leaf, that unmistakable aroma that spoke of celebration and effort. She tasted it, nodded, and smiled softly. "Perfect," she whispered, "just the way Kunle likes it." Kunle Adeyemi, her husband, the man she had built a life around, the man whose shirts she ironed with precision, whose moods she learned to read like a second language, whose dreams she defended even when they scared her. She turned toward the oven where chicken sizzled quietly, golden skin glistening with pepper and oil. Kunle loved chicken like a child loves sweets. The first week of their marriage, he had joked, "Ronke, if you ever want to control me, just cook this." They had laughed then, bodies still new to each other, future still untouched. But that laughter had become rare lately. Kunle had changed, slowly, like a shadow creeping across a wall. He became distant, always tired, always busy, always on his phone. He traveled more than usual, Lagos, Port Harcourt, now Akure for a strategic expansion meeting. When she asked questions, he answered kindly but briefly, as if he was always in a hurry to be somewhere else. Ronken noticed everything, the way he angled his phone away, the way his smiles no longer reached his eyes, the way he stopped asking about her day. But she swallowed her unease the way many African women are taught to, quietly, respectfully, painfully. "He's under pressure," she told herself. "A good wife supports, not suspects." And today was her way of supporting him. She packed the food carefully into thermal containers, wrapping them with foil. Then she walked into the bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of her wardrobe. Hidden beneath folded wrappers was a small cream-colored box. Inside lay a brown leather wristwatch with a gold face, simple, elegant, masculine. Kunle had admired it months ago in a mall in Lagos and laughed it off. "Not now," he had said. "Let me make it first." Ronke had saved, little by little, skipped things for herself, told no one. "He'll be shocked," she smiled, placing the box into a gift bag. Her phone buzzed. A message from Kunle. "Reached Akure safely. Meetings tomorrow. Long day. Talk later." "No, I miss you. No, I love you." She stared at the screen longer than necessary, then locked the phone. "It's fine," she whispered. "I'll see him." She didn't tell him she was coming. She wanted the surprise to remind him that he was not alone, that someone still chose him every day. By evening, she was on the road, clutching her bags as the bus rolled through highways glowing orange under the setting sun. An elderly woman beside her glanced at the food container and smiled. "You're visiting someone special," the woman said. "My husband," Ronke replied, shyly. "Ah, may your surprise bring joy," the woman prayed. "Amen," Ronke said, not knowing how heavy that prayer would become. By nightfall, she stood in the quiet lobby of a boutique hotel in Akure. Soft lights, muted music, calm. She checked in, requested a room on the same floor Kunle had mentioned casually days earlier. 4th floor, room 412. Her heart raced as she walked down the carpeted hallway, every step echoing hope. She rehearsed her smile, adjusted the gift bag, balanced the food in her other hand. I'll knock softly, then say surprise. She raised her hand, and the world paused. Because before her knuckles touched the door, she heard it. A sound, soft first, movement, then laughter. A woman's laughter. Ronke froze. Her smile slipped away slowly, like something sliding off glass. She leaned closer, heart thudding. Maybe it was the television. Maybe the walls were thin. Maybe... Then the laughter came again, clearer, younger, alive. Her breath caught, and the music started, a low Afrobeats track, one she recognized. Kunle used to play it on Sunday mornings when they cleaned the house together. He used to pull her close and say, "This song understands love." Her fingers tightened around the bag. "No," she whispered. Then a voice drifted through the door, a man's voice, familiar, warm. "Come here, baby." The word baby landed inside her chest like a stone dropped into water. Her knees weakened, her heartbeat roared. She pressed her palm against the door, cold metal biting her skin. She knew his voice. She whispered his name, barely audible. "Kunle?" Inside the room, the laughter continued. Sheets rustled. Another voice whispered, playful and teasing. "Don't, you're making me blush." Ronke stumbled backward, leaning against the opposite wall. Her world tilted. Her thoughts scrambled for excuses, any explanation that would save her heart. But then she heard it, clear, sharp, undeniable. "Don't worry about her," Kunle said, voice low and confident. "I'll end it soon." The hallway spun. Ronke slid down the wall, sitting on the carpet, gift bag trembling in her hand. Tears streamed silently down her face. She had come to surprise her husband, but the noise she heard had just destroyed her marriage.
The carpet beneath Aderonke's palms felt rough, grounding her in a reality she desperately wanted to escape. Her chest burned as though someone had scooped out her heart and left a hollow ache behind. She pressed her fist against her mouth to not a misunderstanding. She knew that now. Every memory she had buried over the past months began clawing its way back to the surface. The late nights, the sudden trips, the locked phone, the emotional distance she had excused as stress. Each moment now rearranged itself into a cruel, perfect pattern. Her phone vibrated in her purse. She didn't check it. Nothing on that screen could save her anymore. She wiped her face with shaking fingers and forced herself to stand. Her legs protested, weak and unsteady, but she leaned against the wall until she found balance. The food containers were still warm, the love she cooked still fresh. The irony made her stomach twist. "I need to see," she whispered to herself. Not because she wanted pain, but because denial was no longer an option. She moved slowly back toward the door. Her breath was shallow. Every step felt like walking toward a cliff. She placed her ear against the wood again, bracing herself. Inside, Kunle laughed. The sound stabbed deeper than any insult. "You know I should have done this long ago," he said. A woman replied, her voice intimate and confident. "Then why didn't you?" "Because I was being careful," Kunle answered. "Too careful." Ronke's vision blurred. Careful. With her heart. With her life. With 7 years of sacrifice. Her fingers found the door handle. Cold. Heavy. She didn't plan it. She didn't think. She simply turned it. The door opened silently. The room glowed in warm yellow light. White sheets. A half-empty wine glass. Clothes scattered carelessly on a chair. And there, on the bed, was her husband. Kunle Adeyemi lay against pillows, his arm wrapped around a woman whose head rested comfortably on his chest. They were smiling at each other,
fingers tracing skin like this was normal, like this was deserved. Ronke's breath vanished. Then the woman lifted her head slightly, and the world truly ended. "Bimpei?" Ronke whispered. "Bimpei, her friend, her bridesmaid, the woman who had danced beside her at her wedding and cried during the vows." Kunle looked up. Their eyes met. Time shattered. Ronke didn't scream. She didn't shout. She didn't faint. She simply stared as her life broke apart in perfect clarity. And in that moment, something inside her died quietly, so that something far stronger could be born.
The room fell into a silence so thick it felt alive. Kunle's smile drained from his face as if someone had pulled a plug from his body. His arms slid off Bimpei's shoulder slowly, instinctively, like a child caught stealing. Bimpei herself sat upright, scrambling for the white hotel sheet, her eyes wide, not with shame, but with shock, the kind that comes from being exposed before you're ready. Ronke stood by the door, still holding the gift bag. Her fingers were numb. Her chest rose and fell, but it felt mechanical, like her body was breathing without her permission. "Ronke," Kunle whispered, his voice cracking. That was all he could say. 7 years of marriage, and that was all. She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in months, not as her husband, not as the man she prayed for every morning, but as a stranger who had studied her trust and decided it was disposable. Bimpei found her voice first. "Ronke, this isn't—" Ronke raised her hand, not violently, not dramatically, just enough to stop the lie before it finished forming. "Don't," she said quietly. Her voice surprised even her. It was calm, flat, controlled. It did not shake, and that scared them more than any scream would have. Kunle swung his legs off the bed, panic settling in. "Why are you here?" he asked. Ronke tilted her head slightly, like she was studying a puzzle that already had its answer. "I came to surprise my husband," she said. "I cooked his favorite food. I bought him a gift." She lifted the bag slightly. "I didn't know I was surprising 2 people." Bimpei's eyes dropped. Kunle rubbed his face. "Ronke, please, let me explain." She smiled. Not because she was amused, but because something inside her had snapped into clarity. "No," she said, "you've explained enough." She turned and walked into the room, setting the food gently on the table. The care with which she placed it unsettled them both. "You said you'd end it soon," Kunle continued calmly, her back to them. "When exactly was soon, Kunle?" Silence. She turned back to face him. "You see, I wasn't even angry when I heard the laughter outside," she said. "I was confused. But that sentence—" She paused. "That sentence killed something." Kunle opened his mouth again. Ronke stepped back. "I don't want explanations tonight. I don't want tears. I don't want promises." She picked up her bag. "I want you to remember this moment," she said, her eyes locking with his, "because this is the last time you will ever see me as the woman who begs for truth." She walked out. The door closed softly behind her. Inside the room, Kunle collapsed onto the bed, and Bimpei whispered the first honest thing of the night. "This isn't over." Ronke did not cry that night. That surprised her. She checked into another hotel across town, took a long shower, sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall until morning. Her mind replayed everything, but instead of drowning her, it sharpened her. By dawn, she understood something terrifying and powerful. She had been faithful enough for 2 people, and that ends today. Back in Ibadan, she moved like a ghost through her own house.
Kunle had not returned yet. His absence felt loud, but useful. She packed a small bag and left for her mother's house without leaving a note. Her mother, Iya Ronke, knew immediately something was wrong. "Aderonke," she said gently, touching her daughter's face. "What happened?" Ronke broke then, not loudly, not dramatically, just tears, quiet, steady, honest. Her mother listened without interruption. When Ronke finished, the older woman sat back and sighed. "My daughter," she said, "marriage is not where a woman goes to disappear." Those words stayed. 2 days later, Kunle called. Ronke did not answer. He sent messages, long ones, apologies, explanations, blame dressed as regret. She read none of them. Instead, she did something Kunle never expected. She started remembering who she was before she shrank to fit his comfort. She went back to her old office. She had resigned years ago to support Kunle's business. The HR manager recognized her instantly. "You left too early," the woman said. Ronke smiled. "I'm back." Then she visited a lawyer, not with rage, but with questions. "What are my rights?" she asked calmly. The lawyer raised an eyebrow. "Most people come here crying." Ronke nodded. "I already cried." That night, she opened her laptop and began documenting everything: dates, trips, messages she had once ignored, patterns that now screamed betrayal. She wasn't plotting revenge, she was reclaiming power. And power, once awakened, does not sleep again. 3 weeks later, the truth grew teeth. Ronke ran into an old mutual friend at a supermarket, Sola, Kunle's former colleague. They exchanged pleasantries, then Sola hesitated. "Ronke, are you and Kunle okay?" Ronke smiled politely. "Why?" Sola swallowed. "Because people are talking." "What people?" asked Ronke. "About Bimpe and Kunle," Sola said. Ronke nodded slowly. "Go on." Sola leaned closer. "It didn't start in Akure." The words dropped like poison. "It started last year," Sola continued, "during that Lagos project. Bimpe used Kunle's office to coordinate things." Ronke felt her stomach turn cold. Her office, her house, her life. Sola added quietly, "She used to ask questions about you, your routine, your weaknesses." Ronke thanked him and walked away. That night she sat alone and laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. So it wasn't just lust, it was strategy. Bimpe hadn't just betrayed her marriage, she had studied her. And Kunle? He hadn't fallen accidentally, he had stepped willingly. Ronke closed her eyes. "This ends properly," she whispered, because now this was no longer about heartbreak, it was about truth, exposure, and consequence. And the woman they underestimated had just finished gathering her evidence.
Ronke did not confront Kunle immediately. That restraint confused him. He expected rage, accusations, midnight calls, tears weaponized into guilt. When none of that came, fear replaced confidence. Kunle returned home after weeks of avoidance, finding the house unusually neat, unusually quiet. Ronke's clothes were gone, her toiletries missing. Only her framed wedding photo remained on the wall, untouched, perfectly centered. That image unsettled him more than chaos ever could. He called her endlessly, no answer. Then one evening, a message arrived. "Family meeting, Saturday, 4 p.m., my mother's house." No greeting, no explanation. Kunle exhaled in relief. "Good," he muttered, "she wants to talk." He didn't know Ronke had already spoken, to elders, to witnesses, to truth. Saturday arrived heavy with tension. Her mother's compound filled slowly. Kunle's parents came, his older brother, 2 aunts known for their sharp tongues. Even Bimpe's mother arrived, confused but curious.
In Yoruba culture, elders did not gather like this without reason. Ronke greeted everyone respectfully, calm, composed, dressed simply but with a dignity that made people sit straighter. Kunle searched her face for softness. He found none. When everyone settled, Ronke's mother cleared her throat. "My children," she began, "we are here because a home is shaking." All eyes turned to Ronke. She stood. "My marriage did not break suddenly," she said evenly. "It was dismantled carefully." Kunle shifted. Ronke reached into her bag and placed her phone on the table. "This is not a meeting of insults. It is a meeting of truth." She pressed play. Kunle's voice filled the room. "Don't worry about her. I'll end it soon." The silence that followed was violent. Bimpei's mother gasped. Kunle's aunt dropped her wrapper to her knees. Ronke didn't stop. Screenshots followed. Dates, hotel receipts, messages exchanged during family gatherings. Evidence layered so carefully it felt surgical. Then Ronke said the sentence that cracked everything open. "This affair started before Akure, in my house, in my absence, with my friend." Bimpei stood abruptly. "This is private," she snapped. "You're humiliating me." Ronke looked at her calmly. "No," she replied. "You humiliated yourself. I'm just refusing to hide it." Elders murmured. Heads shook. Kunle's mother covered her face. "My son," she whispered. And in that moment, Kunle understood something irreversible. Ronke was not asking to be chosen anymore. She was closing a chapter. After the meeting, Kunle followed Ronke outside. "Please," he said, "let's talk alone." She stopped walking. "You had many chances to talk. You chose secrecy." Tears filled his eyes. "It meant nothing. I was confused." Ronke laughed, a short, sharp sound. "You planned lies. You scheduled betrayal. Confusion doesn't book hotels." That night, Kunle drank alone in the dark. For the first time, the weight of what he had done settled fully. Not because he had been exposed, but because Ronke no longer looked at him like he mattered. Days passed. Then consequences arrived. Clients withdrew. Word traveled faster than explanations. Respect evaporated. Kunle's business partner called. "This is bad for the brand." The irony burned. Meanwhile, Ronke flourished quietly. She resumed work, found strength in routine, in independence, in rediscovering her voice. One evening, Kunle showed up unannounced at her office. "I'm losing everything," he said desperately. Ronke didn't look up from her computer. "No," she corrected, "you already lost what mattered. Everything else is just following." She stood. "This conversation is over. Please don't come here again." As he left, Kunle finally understood. Love does not always leave loudly. Sometimes it exits politely and never returns. Bimpei thought she had won. For weeks she played the victim, told her version, blamed Ronke's coldness, painted herself as misunderstood. But secrets rot from the inside. Her workplace found out first, then her church, then her fiancé, yes, fiancé, who had been abroad. He returned without warning. "What is this?" he asked, throwing printed screenshots on the table. Bimpei collapsed. She begged, she cried, she blamed loneliness. But betrayal does not negotiate. The engagement ended quietly. Friends withdrew, and one afternoon, Bimpei saw Ronke at a cafe, confident, laughing, alive. Bimpei approached hesitantly. "I never meant to hurt you," she said. Ronke sipped her drink. "I hurt you a lot," she replied, "but I'm not yours." Bimpei lowered her head. Ronke stood. "I hope you heal, but not at my expense." She walked away, and for the first time, Bimpei understood. Some women don't fight you. They outgrow you.
Healing did not arrive like a celebration. It came quietly. Ronke moved into a small apartment not far from her office. 2 bedrooms, clean walls, sunlight that entered freely through wide windows. It wasn't grand, but it was hers. The first night she slept there, she lay awake listening to the silence. Not the heavy silence of abandonment, but the gentle one of freedom. For the first time in years, no one needed her to shrink. She learned new rhythms, morning walks, journaling, saying no without apologizing, cooking meals based on what she craved, not what someone else preferred. Every small decision stitched a piece of her back together. People noticed the change. "You look lighter," a colleague told her. Ronke smiled. "I stopped carrying what wasn't mine." Yet healing is never a straight road. Some nights, memories ambushed her. Kunle's laughter, shared jokes, old photos. She let herself feel the ache, but she no longer unpacked there. Pain visited, but it no longer moved in. One evening, as she locked up her office, a voice stopped her. "Ronke." She turned. It was Tunde, an old friend, former colleague, someone she once trusted but had drifted from after marriage. He looked different, older, calmer. "You look strong," he said, almost surprised. Ronke nodded politely. "Life taught me." They talked, briefly at first, then longer. Coffee turned into conversation, conversation into laughter. For the first time since everything broke, Ronke felt something unfamiliar. Interest. And that frightened her more than loneliness ever did. Kunle saw the photo online. Ronke, smiling, sitting across from a man. His chest tightened. He had told himself he still had time, that Ronke just needed space, that marriage, like elastic, would stretch but snap back. Seeing her happy shattered that illusion. He went to her apartment uninvited. When Ronke opened the door, she didn't step back. "Kunle," she said calmly. "I need to talk," he said urgently. "You've said that before." "I made a mistake," he pleaded. "I'll do therapy, counseling, anything." Ronke studied him. "I believe you're sorry," she said, "but remorse is not a time machine." Tears streamed down his face. "I still love you." She exhaled slowly. "I loved who you pretended to be, and I forgive you." Hope flickered in his eyes. "But forgiveness," she continued, "does not mean access." She closed the door gently. Kunle stood there long after. For the first time, he truly understood. Some doors close not out of anger, but out of wisdom. Tunde asked her out properly a week later. Dinner. No pressure, just honesty. Ronke hesitated. "I'm not broken, but I'm rebuilding." Tunde nodded. "I'm not here to rush you. I just want to know you." That night, Ronke sat alone, staring at the ceiling. She realized something startling. She wasn't afraid of loving again. She was afraid of losing herself again. The next morning, she wrote 3 rules in her journal. "I will not beg for clarity. I will not ignore my intuition. I will not disappear to keep peace." She closed the book. That evening, she met Tunde. "I'll try," she said simply. And in that moment, she felt it. The quiet strength of a woman who no longer negotiates her worth. Not because she had healed completely, but because she had learned how not to abandon herself again.
Life did not punish Kunle loudly. It corrected him slowly. The business he once built on confidence and charm began to hollow out. Partners stopped calling. Invitations dried up. Even his friends grew tired of explaining him. Not because he was a villain, but because he had become a reminder of how easily trust can be wasted. He tried to start over. New city, new promises, new discipline. But guilt has a way of following quietly. Some nights he would wake up reaching for a woman who no longer existed in his life, not because she left angrily, but because she left finished. Bimpe moved away, not triumphantly, not dramatically, just diminished. She learned the hard way that winning someone else's husband is not victory, it is inheritance of chaos. Everywhere she went, whispers followed. People smiled politely, but trusted carefully. She tried to justify herself for a long time. Then she stopped talking about Ronke altogether, because the truth had settled. She hadn't taken a man, she had exposed herself. And karma, when patient, is terrifyingly accurate. Tunde never tried to impress Ronke. He listened. He asked questions and waited for real answers. He didn't raise his voice during disagreements. He didn't disappear when things got uncomfortable. He didn't ask her to shrink. That alone felt revolutionary. Months passed. Trust grew organically, not through promises, but through consistency. Ronke noticed herself doing something new, relaxing. One evening, as they walked side by side under streetlights, Tunde stopped suddenly. "What?" she asked. "I just realized," he said, smiling softly. "You don't apologize for existing." Ronke laughed. "That's new," she admitted. She didn't rush the future, didn't announce anything publicly, didn't need validation. This time, love didn't feel like labor. It felt like partnership. And most importantly, it did not demand the death of who she was. Exactly 1 year after Akure, Ronke returned to that city, not for closure, for work. She stayed in a different hotel, walked the streets without flinching, ate dinner alone, and enjoyed it. The past no longer owned the geography of her life. That night, she opened her journal. She reread the first entry she had written after everything collapsed. "I don't know who I am without my marriage." She smiled gently and turned the page. Then she wrote, "I found out." The next morning, as she checked out, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "This is Kunle. I just wanted you to know, losing you taught me everything." Ronke stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she did something that surprised even her. She didn't reply, not out of bitterness, but because some lessons don't require acknowledgement. She stepped outside into the sunlight, lifted her face, and breathed deeply. Once she had traveled with food, gifts, and hope to surprise a man who no longer deserved her. Now she carried only herself, and she was enough. Sometimes the greatest revenge is not destruction. It is becoming so whole that the past can no longer recognize you.
Stories like this are not just told, they are shared. If this resonated with you, tap the like button, leave a comment, and tell us what you felt. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about healing, boundaries, and becoming whole again.